I remember that day so clearly, as if it just happened yesterday. The smell of the old, creaky building, the faint mustiness of its unpainted walls, and the silence that always seemed to settle over our apartment block after sundown. We lived on the 3rd floor, just my mom and me, in a rundown Soviet-era building on the edge of town. I was 8 at the time. I didn't think much of the place. After all, it was home. But it was the kind of place adults always seemed uneasy about. I guess I never noticed how often my mother crossed herself when we passed the hallway, how she would mutter a quick prayer whenever the temperature dropped, which was surprisingly often for a building that had no air conditioning, or how she avoided the stairs after dark, choosing instead to take the rickety elevator, even if it groaned with every inch it climbed. But I did notice one thing. There was always a strange chill on the 3rd floor landing, right in front of the window, overlooking the courtyard. It was small, but you could see the playground below from that window, the swing set, the patches of dead grass, and the crumbling sandbox. The air was always cold there, no matter the season. I used to think it was just a draft, or maybe that the building was old and couldn't hold in the heat properly. But my friends, when they still visited, always joked about how it was haunted. "That window has seen things," they'd whisper. I laughed it off, too young and too stubborn to believe in ghosts. Until that day, I had been playing with my soccer ball, bouncing it down the hallway and trying to keep myself entertained. My mom was busy, cooking dinner, and I was bored out of my mind. The ball slipped from my hands and rolled down the hall, right toward that cursed window. I sprinted after it without a second thought. And then, something stopped me. It was as though my body froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. I was only a few feet from the window when I saw it. A shadow. Not just a regular shadow cast by the dim lights in the hall, but something darker. Something that stood out like it didn't belong in the natural world. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind, some play of light and exhaustion. But it moved, slowly, deliberately, toward me. I remember the way my heart pounded. The shadow loomed closer, and though it had no distinct shape, I could feel its intent. Malicious, angry. Suddenly, I felt a hand, cold as ice, wrap around my ankle. My eyes widened in terror, and before I could react, it yanked me forward, hard. I felt my body lift off the ground. Then pain, unimaginable pain. My back hit the pavement, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My mother was sobbing quietly beside me, her face pale, eyes red from crying. I couldn't feel my legs. I tried to move, but nothing happened. Panic welled up inside me. But before I could say anything, a doctor entered the room, confirming what I already feared. I was paralyzed from the waist down. I would never walk again. But that wasn't the worst part. Even now, after all these years, I still see that shadow. It lingers at the edges of my vision, always watching, waiting. Every time I pass that window in my wheelchair, the air grows cold, and I swear I can feel that icy hand brushing against me, as if it's waiting for a second chance, waiting to finish what it started. The months after the fall were a blur. I was confined to the wheelchair, barely able to adjust to the new reality of my life. The doctors had tried to be optimistic, telling me that physical therapy might help me regain some mobility. But I knew better. Deep down, I understood that my injury wasn't just physical. That thing, whatever it was, had taken more than just my ability to walk. It had left a mark, something invisible but ever-present. The strange occurrences began almost immediately after I returned home. It started with small things. The temperature in our apartment would drop suddenly, even in the middle of summer. Objects, cups, books, and even my wheelchair at times would shift slightly when no one was looking. At first, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the trauma of the fall had been severe. Maybe my brain was just trying to cope. But it wasn't long before my mother noticed, too. "Did you move this?" she asked one evening, holding up a photo frame that had been on the other side of the room just minutes before. I shook my head. "No, I didn't touch it." Her face went pale and she quickly put the frame down. She had always been a superstitious woman, raised on old folk tales about spirits and curses. I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was, but she refused to speak it out loud. A few days later, I overheard her on the phone with my grandmother, whispering in Ukrainian about bad spirits and the curse of the third floor. I couldn't understand all of it, but I knew enough. Whatever had pushed me wasn't done. It was still here, still haunting our home. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced, and I stared at the door, terrified that it would open and I'd see the shadow again. But the door never opened. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours before they finally stopped. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak, every groan of the building sent my nerves into overdrive. I began to dread the nights, knowing that whatever was in the apartment was growing bolder. It was a rainy afternoon when everything escalated. My mother was at work. That's when I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voice grew louder, clearer. It was calling my name. I turned my wheelchair toward the door, but I saw no one. The apartment was silent. The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. My skin prickled with fear, but some strange force compelled me to move toward it. I wheeled myself out of the room, the sound growing louder with each push. The air was colder now, just like it had been the day I fell. My breath fogged in front of me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. And then I saw it. The window. The same window I had been thrown from. But something was different. The shadow was there, clearer than before. It seemed to pulse, as if alive, and it was waiting for me. Suddenly, the wheelchair jerked forward, as if an invisible force was pushing me. My hands gripped the wheels, trying to stop, but I couldn't. The cold hand was back, pulling me toward the edge, toward the window, toward the fall. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the empty hall. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was still in the hallway, but the shadow was gone. The window stood open, rainwater pooling on the floor. I was drenched but alive. Whatever had tried to pull me out had failed. But I knew it wasn't over. The ghost of the third floor wasn't finished with me yet, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it off. In the days after the hallway incident, I became a prisoner in my own home. My mother noticed my fear, of course, but I couldn't tell her what was really happening. She already had too much to worry about, taking care of me, working late hours to pay for my therapy, and now trying to protect our apartment from whatever was haunting us. I stopped going near the window entirely, which wasn't hard since my mother now kept it locked. But I still felt it, the presence. It was stronger now, like a weight pressing on my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. I could feel the cold creeping closer, invading every room of our apartment. At night, the footsteps in the hallway grew louder, more insistent. They would start just after midnight and continue until dawn. Sometimes they were accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I never dared to investigate.
My nightmares worsened.
I would dream of the shadow standing over me, watching. Its eyes, or at least where its eyes should have been, would burn into my mind. Every dream ended the same way. I became convinced that it was only a matter of time before it tried to finish the job. And I didn't know how to stop it. It was on one of these nights, as the footsteps echoed through the hall, that I heard a knock at our door. My mother had just come home from work and was in the kitchen, making a late dinner. We both froze. The knock was soft, but persistent, 3 slow, deliberate taps. My mother hesitated before answering it. When she opened the door, there stood an old woman. She was short, hunched over, with a face lined like crumpled paper. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something from decades ago, and she smelled faintly of herbs and something else, something like dust. "I need to speak to your son," the woman rasped, her voice as ancient as her appearance. My mother looked at me, confusion and fear in her eyes. "What do you want with him?" she asked, shielding me instinctively. "I know what haunts you," the old woman said, her eyes flicking toward me. "I know what took him down that day." My heart leaped in my chest. How could she know? We'd never told anyone the full story, never spoken of the shadow, or the cold, or the whispering. "Let her in," I whispered. My mother reluctantly stepped aside, and the old woman shuffled into our apartment. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the room like she could see things we couldn't. Finally, she settled herself on the couch across from me, her gaze piercing. "The spirit that haunts this building," she began, "is older than anyone here knows. It has been tied to this place for generations. A restless soul, cursed to remain in limbo, and it feeds on fear, on suffering." She turned her eyes to me. "It sensed your vulnerability that day, and it claimed you as its next victim." I shuddered, the memory of the fall rushing back. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The woman's eyes softened, though her expression remained grim. "Because you were young and it is drawn to the innocent. The fall was meant to break more than just your body. It wanted to claim your soul, to bind you to this place." "But why didn't it succeed?" my mother asked, gripping the back of a chair as if she might faint. The old woman glanced at me, her eyes narrowing. "It didn't succeed because you resisted, but it's not done. The spirit is patient. It will wait, and it will strike again when you are at your weakest." The old woman explained that the spirit could be bound, but it would not be easy. "There is a way to trap it," she said, her voice low, "but it requires you to confront it, to face the place where it attacked you. You must show it that you are not afraid." I wasn't sure I could do it. The thought of going back to that window, of facing whatever had pushed me, filled me with terror. But what choice did I have? It wasn't going to leave me alone, and I couldn't live the rest of my life in fear. We made preparations over the next few days. The old woman gave us a bundle of herbs, some strange hand-carved stones, and instructions for a ritual. My mother was skeptical, but she went along with it, desperate for a solution. The plan was simple. We had to perform the ritual at the window at night when the spirit was strongest. The old woman said she would guide us, but I would need to be the one to stand at the center of the ritual. "You are the one it wants," she said. "Only you can confront it." The night of the ritual came sooner than I expected. The air in the apartment felt heavier than ever, and the cold was so intense it made my teeth chatter. My mother wheeled me to the window, the same spot where I had been pulled so many months before. The old woman arranged the herbs and stones in a circle around me, muttering something under her breath. Then the footsteps began, louder this time, almost a thunderous march down the hallway. The whispers followed, growing more urgent, more angry. The air shifted, growing even colder. "Stay strong," the old woman urged, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. I stared at the window, heart pounding. The shadow appeared, darker and larger than I had ever seen it. It seemed to fill the entire hallway, pressing against the walls, seeping into every corner of the room. Its presence was suffocating, but I couldn't look away. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, just like before. The room felt like it was spinning as the shadow loomed over me. I could feel it testing me, waiting for that flicker of fear, that moment of weakness it could exploit. But I didn't give in. The old woman's voice echoed in the back of my mind. You must show it that you are not afraid. I forced myself to breathe, staring directly into the darkness. My hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair, knuckles white, but I refused to flinch. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirit could sense its grip slipping. The cold intensified, freezing my breath in the air, but still I held on. Finally, with one last surge of strength, I shouted into the dark, "You don't control me anymore." The words seemed to echo around the room, bouncing off the walls. The shadow wavered for just a moment, as if uncertain. Then, with a sound like rushing wind, it retreated, pulled back toward the window. There was a deafening crack as the window shattered outward, the spirit fleeing into the night. For the first time in months, the air was warm again. I knew it was over. The months that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. I had expected peace, but instead, I was haunted by the absence of fear. The building no longer creaked at night, and the cold drafts had disappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I threw myself into physical therapy, though the doctors had little hope for a full recovery. They had been clear. The damage to my spine was irreversible. But I wasn't just fighting for my legs. I was fighting to reclaim my life. The wheelchair had become a symbol of what the spirit had taken from me. I needed to prove that it hadn't won. Even so, I couldn't help but notice how everyone else in the building seemed to be moving on with their lives too. Neighbors, once whispering about strange happenings, were now more open, more social. The hallways, once deserted after dark, were now alive with the sounds of people passing, laughing, as though they had forgotten the curse that had hung over us. But I hadn't forgotten. One night, a few weeks after the ritual, I was wheeling myself down the hall to get some air by the window, the one where it had all started. I hadn't gone near it since the night we banished the spirit. I had avoided it like a bad memory, but now I felt compelled to face it, just to see. The window had been replaced, the glass clear and solid. I wheeled up to it and looked down at the courtyard below. The playground was quiet, the swings swaying gently in the night breeze, untouched. I should have felt some kind of closure, but instead, a strange sensation crept over me. A feeling that something was off, though I couldn't place what it was. And then I heard it, a faint tap, a rhythmic sound, like a finger tapping lightly against glass. I leaned closer to the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The tapping came again. I looked down and there it was, the handprint, pressed against the outside of the glass, high up, as if someone or something had reached up from below. Cold dread filled my veins. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it had to be a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was still there, the unmistakable outline of a human hand. Too small to be an adult's, but far too large for a child's. I backed away, my hands trembling on the wheels of my chair. I could feel it again, the cold presence, the darkness creeping at the edges of my vision. It hadn't left. It was waiting, and it was still watching. The next morning, I told my mother what I had seen. She tried to brush it off, saying it must have been condensation or dirt on the window, but I saw the fear in her eyes. She knew what it meant. The old woman had warned us that the spirit wouldn't leave so easily. She had said it would wait, that it could return if it found a way back in. I had thought that night, when the window shattered and the shadow fled, that it was over. But now I wasn't so sure. I decided to visit the old woman, to see if she had any more answers. She lived in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and a garden that looked like it had seen better days. My mother had taken me there once after the ritual to thank her for her help. Now I was going alone. When I knocked on her door, it opened almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. "You saw it again, didn't you?" she asked, her voice a low rasp. I nodded, swallowing hard. It left a handprint. On the window. The old woman sighed and gestured for me to come inside. The air in her home was thick with the smell of herbs and incense, the walls lined with shelves full of strange, dusty objects. She motioned for me to sit at her small, wooden table, then sat down across from me, her gnarled hands resting on the table. "It hasn't fully left," she said quietly. "I told you it wouldn't give up so easily." "Why now?" I asked. "We banished it. I thought it was gone." "You weakened it," she said, her eyes narrowing as she stared at me, like she could see into the space between worlds. "But it's tied to this place. The fall, the injury, it created a bond between you and the spirit. A bond that's not easily broken." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "So, it's never going to stop?" The old woman's gaze softened, but the weight of her words hung heavy. "There may still be a way to sever the bond, but it will require a deeper confrontation. The spirit is old and stubborn. It's holding on to something, some piece of its past that it can't let go. You'll have to face it where it's strongest, where it's tied." "The window?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The place where you first fell." My heart skipped a beat. The courtyard. The thought of going back to the courtyard made my stomach turn. I hadn't been there since the accident. I had avoided looking at it, even from the window, because it reminded me too much of that day. The fall, the pain, the helplessness. But if there was even a chance to stop the spirit for good, I had no choice. The old woman gave me instructions. "Go at dusk, when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. Take the stones from the ritual and place them in a circle around where you fell. You'll need to call it out, make it reveal itself. And then," I asked, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my chest, "then you'll confront it. You'll find out what it wants. And if you're strong enough, you can break its hold." That evening I went to the courtyard. My mother wanted to come with me, but I insisted on going alone. This was something I had to face by myself. The sun was just beginning to set as I wheeled myself toward the playground. The air was cool, the sky tinged with red and purple. The place where I had fallen was still there, an uneven patch of grass and dirt, now overgrown but unmistakable. I could almost feel the weight of the past pressing down on me as I approached. With trembling hands, I placed the stones in a circle, just as the old woman had instructed. Then I waited. For a while, nothing happened. The courtyard was eerily silent, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the spirit had decided to leave me alone. But then, the air grew colder. The shadows lengthened, and there, in the fading light, I saw it. The shadow. Not just a figure this time, but a form vague and shifting, but undeniably human. It hovered just beyond the circle of stones, watching me, waiting. I took a deep breath and spoke the words the old woman had told me. "Why are you still here? What do you want?" The shadow didn't answer, but it moved closer, pushing against the invisible barrier the stones had created. I could feel its anger, its desperation. And then, in a voice like a distant echo, it spoke. I was pushed. The words hung in the air, cold and hollow. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The shadow's form flickered, becoming clearer for just a moment. I could see the outline of a boy about my age when I fell. He looked like a child lost in time, his clothes ragged, his face twisted in pain and confusion. "I was pushed," he repeated, his voice filled with sorrow. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just a malicious spirit. It was the ghost of a boy who had died in this building, pushed to his death just like I had almost been. The anger, the darkness, it wasn't just evil. It was grief. Grief and confusion trapped for decades. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The shadow wavered, as if unsure what to do. I could feel the weight of its sorrow pressing down on me, but I didn't flinch. "You don't have to stay here anymore," I said softly. "You can move on." For a long moment, the boy's ghost didn't move. Then, slowly, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the evening air like mist. The cold lifted, and the weight that had been pressing on my chest was gone. It was over. The spirit never returned after that night. The cold spots, the whispers, the footsteps, all of it was gone. The building felt lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted from over us all. My mother and I slowly began to rebuild our lives, free from the haunting that had plagued us for so long. I still think about the boy, though, the one who had been pushed. I don't know who he was, or how long he had been trapped in this place. But I hope, wherever he is now, he's found peace. As for me, I'm still in the wheelchair. The doctors say there's a chance I'll never walk again. Months passed after that final night in the courtyard, and life began to feel normal again, or as close to normal as it could. The spirit never returned. The cold spots, the whispers, and the footsteps were gone, as though they had never existed. My mother and I slowly resumed our routines. But something else had taken the place of the ghost. It started with the dreams. At first, they were hazy, fragmented, just flashes of images, sounds, and feelings that didn't make sense. I brushed them off, thinking they were just remnants of my trauma. After all, it wasn't uncommon to have nightmares after what I'd been through. But these dreams were different. They didn't feel like nightmares. They felt like glimpses into something I wasn't supposed to see. The first time it happened, I dreamed of a place I had never been before. An old house, nestled deep in the woods, its windows shattered, the roof caved in. It was nighttime, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of dread. I could hear voices inside, hushed and frantic, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. When I woke up, the dream lingered in my mind, vivid and unsettling. But I didn't think much of it until I saw the news the next morning. A house, exactly like the one I had seen in my dream, had burned down the night before. The fire had started in the middle of the night, just as I had been dreaming of it. The voices I'd heard. People had been trapped inside, calling for help as the flames consumed the building. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It was too much of a coincidence. That was the first dream, but it wasn't the last. After the dream of the burning house, the dreams came more frequently. Every few nights, I would find myself in another place. Sometimes in the past, other times in the future, or even in the present, but somewhere far away from me. Each dream felt more real than the last, like I was living someone else's life, seeing through their eyes. One night, I dreamed of a car accident. I was sitting in the passenger seat of a speeding car, the driver frantically trying to control the wheel as we skidded on a wet road. I could feel the panic, the rush of adrenaline. In the dream, I saw the exact moment the car lost control, flipping over and crashing into a ditch. I woke up gasping for breath, my hands shaking. The dream had been so vivid, so terrifyingly real. It took me hours to calm down, but eventually, I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just another nightmare. The next day, I saw it on the news. A car had crashed late the night before, on a road I recognized from the dream. The driver had lost control in the rain, just like I had seen. The details matched exactly. I I started to realize that these dreams weren't just dreams. They were visions, glimpses into the future, the past, and sometimes events unfolding in real time. They came without warning, showing me things I couldn't possibly know. But the worst part was that I couldn't control them. I couldn't choose what I saw or when I saw it. The dreams came on their own, pulling me into their world whether I wanted to be there or not. At first, I thought the dreams were showing me random events, things that didn't affect me directly. But soon, the visions started to hit closer to home. One night, I dreamed of my mother. She was sitting at our kitchen table, her face pale and lined with worry. The light above her flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I watched her look down at a stack of medical bills, her hands trembling as she held her head in her hands. In the dream, I felt her fear. I felt the weight of her burden, the stress of trying to keep us afloat financially while taking care of me. When I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I went to her that morning, asking if everything was okay. She tried to brush it off, telling me not to worry, but I could see the truth in her eyes. The bills were piling up, and she was struggling more than she let on. I realized then that the dreams weren't just about strangers or distant places. They were about my life too, showing me things I wasn't meant to see, giving me knowledge I wasn't sure I wanted. The more I dreamed, the more I felt like I was carrying a heavy burden. It was one thing to know the future, but it was another to be powerless to stop it. I couldn't warn people about the accidents I saw or prevent the tragedies from happening. I was just an observer, trapped in the space between past, present, and future, watching as everything unfolded. As the dreams grew more intense, I started to see things that didn't seem to belong to any particular time. One night, I found myself standing in the hallway of our apartment building, but it wasn't the building I knew. It was old, decrepit, like something from decades ago. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I could hear distant voices, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of something rotten lingered in the air. I felt a deep sense of unease as I wandered through the building, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. And then I saw him, the boy, the one who had pushed me. He stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide and hollow, his face pale and gaunt. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me, as though he was waiting for something. I tried to speak, to ask him what he wanted, but no sound came out. The boy's gaze never wavered, and slowly, the walls around me began to shift. The apartment building was transforming, its past and present colliding. I could see the ghosts of its history, the people who had lived here long before us, their lives etched into the walls. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. That dream had been different, darker, more intense. It wasn't just a vision of the past. It was like I had stepped into another layer of reality, where time didn't follow the same rules. I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was trying to tell me something, that there was more to his story than I had understood before. One evening, I sat in the living room, staring out the window, trying to make sense of it all. The dreams, the visions, what did they mean? Was I meant to do something with this knowledge? Or was I just a passive witness to things beyond my control? That night, I had another dream. This time, it was of the present. I saw myself, sitting in the living room just as I was now, staring out the same window. But in the dream, there was something different. I looked to my left, and there, sitting beside me, was the boy, the ghost who had haunted me, the one I thought I had freed. But he wasn't threatening this time. He was just there, silent, watching the world with me. When I woke up, I sat in that same spot, looking out the window, waiting for something to happen. And for a moment, just for a brief, flickering moment, I thought I saw him again, standing in the reflection of the glass. He was no longer the shadow that had haunted my life. He was something else. Maybe a guide. Maybe a warning. Or maybe, just like me, he was someone who had once glimpsed the future and now knew too much.
I still dream.
And the dreams still show me things. Fragments of the past, flashes of the future, and moments that are happening right now. They've become a part of me, something I've had to accept, no matter how unsettling they are. But now, when I dream, I no longer feel alone. The boy is always there, watching with me, and together we see everything that is, was, and will be.